Tonight, we step back into the 19th century, into a world of coal smoke, lamplight, and heavy wool. A world where winters were long, harsh, and often unforgiving. A time when every household, from the grandest townhouse to the smallest worker's cottage, felt the weight of the season pressing in. So before you settle in, take a second to make sure you're cozy. If you enjoy these kinds of late-night history wanderings, consider subscribing. And if you'd like, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always interesting to see who's listening along from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe put on a small fan just for that steady hum in the background. And let's slowly drift into tonight's story together. As autumn faded, a quiet urgency settled over the Victorian household. Winter was not a surprise. It was expected, certain, inevitable. And so families began their preparations weeks before the first frost appeared. Coal deliveries were one of the first signs. In wealthier homes, wagons arrived, unloading black heaps into cellar stores. Servants shoveled and stacked, careful to keep enough to last through the bitterest nights. In working-class streets, coal was bought in smaller quantities, a sack at a time, sometimes even less, carried home by hand. The poor often relied on scraps of coal picked up near the yards, or even bits scavenged from roadsides. Fuel meant warmth, fuel meant survival, and every family measured it carefully. Windows were another concern. Thin glass, set in drafty frames, let in the chill. Families pressed strips of cloth or paper around the edges, hoping to block the icy gusts. Some used heavy curtains, drawn tight as soon as the light faded. Even so, the cold often crept in. On the coldest mornings, frost formed patterns inside the panes, delicate ferns traced in ice. In kitchens, the work of preserving food became urgent. Root vegetables, potatoes, carrots, turnips were carried into cellars, stored in sand or straw to keep them from rotting. Jars of pickles lined the shelves, gleaming in the dim light. Salt pork hung in pantries, its sharp scent filling the air. Families knew these stores must last until spring, so every piece of food was precious. Candles and oil were also prepared. Nights were long, and light was costly. Some families saved stubs of candles, setting them aside for the darkest days of January. Others relied on the glow of the fire, stretching what little light they had. Clothing, too, was checked and mended. Wool coats were brushed, shawls patched, children's boots resoled. In the wealthier homes, seamstresses stitched new winter garments, heavy dresses, lined cloaks, warm underthings. In poorer families, every scrap of fabric was used again. Old garments were cut down for younger children. Holes were patched again and again. Warmth was not a matter of style, but of survival. All of this preparation carried a mixture of dread and comfort. Dread because winter was always hard. Illness would spread. Work could be scarce. The cold seemed endless, but there was also comfort in routine. Families had done this before. Their parents and their parents before them had faced the same season. Winter came, and people endured. As December drew near, the signs of change grew sharper. The sun dipped low, setting in the afternoon. The air turned sharp and biting, carrying the smell of coal smoke from every chimney. In the mornings, breath showed in clouds, even indoors. Horses' hooves rang on frozen cobblestones, and the clatter of carts echoed down narrow streets. For children, winter held both fear and wonder. They saw the frost sparkle like tiny stars on windowsills. They marveled at icicles hanging from eaves, yet they also felt the sting of chilblains on fingers and toes, the ache of cold that seeped into thin shoes. The excitement of snow was always paired with the knowledge of hardship. In the countryside, preparations followed a similar rhythm. Farmers stacked hay for livestock. Sheep were gathered into pens, barns filled with straw. Families chopped wood and stored it in neat piles. Kitchens smelled of drying herbs, of apples stored in cool lofts, of bread baking against the gathering dark. The season was not merely endured, it was anticipated. The long months ahead would be demanding, but they also held traditions. Christmas, New Year, simple evenings by the fire, the warmth of community in the city, in the country, in great houses and small cottages, people braced themselves. Winter had arrived, and so the season began, with coal stacked high, windows sealed tight, pantries full, and hearts both anxious and hopeful. It was a familiar ritual, repeated year after year, a time of careful preparation and a quiet acceptance of what was to come. Winter was not kind, but it was constant, and the Victorians knew how to meet it. As autumn faded completely and November settled in, Victorian households turned their attention more urgently toward the cold months ahead. The early efforts of stocking coal bins, patching roofs, and collecting candles gave way to a more constant rhythm of small preparations. The idea of winter was no longer abstract. It was at the doorstep. Every day carried reminders, shorter light, sharper winds, and the thin crust of frost appearing on garden soil. Families across Britain felt this transition in ways that were at once practical and emotional. For those living in crowded urban neighborhoods, where rows of terraced houses lined smoky streets, winter meant heavy smog mixing with chill air. The sharp temps of coal smoke clung to everything: coats, curtains, even the bread purchased from local bakers. For those in rural cottages, the feeling was different, quieter, perhaps, but filled with the same urgency. Farmers hauled the last of their root vegetables into cool storage cellars, salted down meat, and repaired barn roofs that might need to withstand heavy snow. Inside the home, the rhythm of preparation was deeply tactile. Mothers and daughters might spend entire afternoons examining the family's clothing. Wool stockings were checked for holes, coats for thin elbows, and mittens for fraying seams. Sewing baskets rarely stayed shut during November. In wealthier households, seamstresses or hired help might handle the work, turning old garments into new by adding extra fabric or cutting down adult coats for children. But in working-class homes, these tasks were personal and pressing. A hole left unmended could mean numb fingers in January, and a thin pair of trousers could turn a simple walk to school into misery. Food, too, demanded constant thought. The staples of a Victorian winter pantry: potatoes, carrots, onions, salted meats, dried beans, had to be monitored carefully. In many homes, a mother kept a mental ledger of what was left and how long it might last. Some families made the effort to put up preserves in autumn, boiling fruit with sugar and sealing it in jars, though sugar was not cheap. Root cellars were visited daily, inspected for rot, and arranged so that older vegetables would be eaten first. Even for wealthier families, the absence of refrigeration meant that food storage required vigilance. For poorer households, it was a daily worry, a constant calculation of how to stretch each loaf, each bit of fat, each slice of pork. The mood of the household reflected these concerns. Children, of course, often looked forward to snow and the novelty of sledding or skating when frozen ponds allowed it. But adults bore the heavier knowledge that winter tested endurance, health, and spirit. The father of a working-class family might worry whether his wages would cover the extra coal needed in January. A mother might quietly wonder if she could nurse her infant through the coughing fevers that so often swept through damp, cold rooms. In rural villages, families fretted over whether the hay stored for animals would prove sufficient if spring came late. At the same time, winter preparations carried small comforts. In cities, street vendors sold roasted chestnuts, their smoky sweetness perfuming the air. Children, clutching pennies, looked forward to that rare treat. In the home, the act of drawing curtains tightly against the cold gave a sense of security, a symbolic barrier between the family and the biting wind outside. The ritual of checking door latches, sealing cracks with rags, and placing heavy curtains across entryways was not only practical but reassuring. For wealthier families, preparations took on a more organized elegance. Coal deliveries arrived in larger quantities, sometimes stacked high in back gardens or stored in cellars that were cleaned for the purpose. Servants polished fire grates and ensured that wood was ready for kindling. Extra blankets were aired out, sheets pressed and laid neatly in linen cupboards. In some cases, households even purchased specialized winter equipment, heavier draperies, thicker rugs, or new fur-lined cloaks for outings. In London or other large cities, carriage owners ordered winter wheels or checked lanterns to ensure safe travel through fog and snow. By contrast, the poor often improvised. Old sacking might be nailed over drafty doorways. Newspaper was sometimes layered beneath thin mattresses to add insulation. If coal was too dear, families relied on whatever wood could be gathered. Broken furniture, scavenged branches, or even bits of scrap wood from nearby workshops. The differences in preparation underscored the sharp divides of Victorian society. One family might feel mild inconvenience when a delivery was delayed, while another faced the prospect of a freezing night if a few pennies could not be scraped together for fuel. The atmosphere of expectation grew heavier as December neared. Across the country, the light dwindled to a faint gray by late afternoon, and households adjusted their routines. Oil lamps were lit earlier each evening, and the careful rationing of candles became a habit. Even children learned the rhythm. Play had to finish before dusk, chores completed while light still lingered. In poorer homes, where every candle mattered, nights became shorter, filled with sleep rather than wasted illumination. Beyond the household, communities also prepared collectively. Markets reflected the season. Butchers sold more preserved meats, while bakers offered dense breads designed to keep longer. In villages, neighbors exchanged small favors, a borrowed tool, a shared jar of preserves, a helping hand in repairing a leaky roof. In cities, the sight of chimney sweeps became common, for it was vital to have flues cleared before fires burned day and night. Newspapers carried advertisements for everything from warm clothing to patent remedies for winter colds. And in churches, sermons often turned toward themes of endurance, patience, and charity, reminding congregations of the hardships that lay ahead. Yet, despite the looming cold, there was a rhythm of comfort in these preparations. Families found reassurance in repetition. The chopping of kindling, the stacking of coal, the careful stitching of a child's mittens. The human ability to prepare, to ready oneself against adversity, created its own sense of strength. Every sealed window pane and every jar of preserved fruit was a quiet victory against the season. As the final weeks of autumn gave way to winter proper, Victorian families carried into December both dread and determination. Some felt a spark of hope at the thought of Christmas, with its brief promise of light and festivity. Others thought more practically of the weeks beyond, when January's bitter winds would test every preparation made. But whether wealthy or poor, urban or rural, each family shared in that collective pause, that drawing of breath before the long winter began. And so, as the first frosts deepened and nights lengthened further, the stage was set. The hearth would soon become the heart of every home. Fires tended with care, warmth rationed with discipline. Winter had arrived, and with it came the true test of Victorian life: to endure, to adapt, and to seek comfort where little could be found. If the Victorian household had a single lifeline in the winter months, it was the fire. A coal fire, glowing in the grate, was not simply a source of warmth, it was survival itself. Each morning, before the pale light of dawn crept through frost-trimmed windows, someone in the house had to rise and coax the embers back to life. For the wealthy, it was a servant's job. Maids moving quietly through cold corridors, carrying scuttles of coal and kindling, striking flints or matches to encourage the reluctant flames. For poorer families, it was the mother, or perhaps the eldest child, fumbling in the dark, hands stiff with cold, trying to breathe warmth into a hearth that never seemed to hold enough heat. Coal was the backbone of Victorian heating. By the middle of the century, Britain was mining and burning it at an astonishing scale, and its presence seeped into nearly every home. The rich could afford cartloads, delivered and stacked neatly. The poor bought it by the sack, sometimes by the single lump, and often on credit. Street cries of coal, coal, echoed through narrow lanes, and children followed wagons, scavenging stray pieces that fell into the mud. The supply meant the difference between a home where the cold could be pushed back, if only for a few hours, and one where frost clung even to the inside walls. Inside, the fireplace defined the rhythms of the day. In a prosperous home, each major room might have its own fire. The drawing room fire was banked carefully, burning through the afternoon, so that guests would find warmth when they arrived. Bedrooms, too, might have small fireplaces, lit at bedtime. In contrast, the laboring family in a cramped terrace house often relied on a single stove or kitchen hearth. There, cooking and heating blurred together, and the family huddled in the same space, day after day, while other rooms went unused, too bitterly cold to enter. Even with fires burning, warmth was never guaranteed. Drafts found their way under doors and through thin glass panes. Many Victorians spoke of waking to discover ice tracing delicate patterns on the inside of their bedroom windows. Coal itself, though essential, was temperamental. It smoked heavily when damp. It left a sticky residue of soot that coated walls, ceilings, and lungs alike. Chimneys demanded constant sweeping to prevent dangerous fires, and boys were still sent into those narrow shafts to brush down the grime, their bodies made raw by the soot. Thus, every glow of heat carried its hidden costs. Yet the fire was also comfort. Its light flickered on brass fire guards, cast gentle shadows on plaster walls, and gave the family a point of gathering. To To sit with hands outstretched toward the grate, to listen to the crackle of coal or the sigh of kindling, was to feel, if only briefly, that the harshness of the season could be held at bay. By evening, the fireplace was once again the center of the household's world. After a long day of battling the cold outdoors or working in frigid factories and workshops, Victorians would return home to gather around the fire. Families placed chairs as close as possible to the warmth, leaving the backs of the room in shadow and chill. The fire was rarely large enough to heat the entire space, so one side of the body might grow warm while the other remained cold, a strangely familiar discomfort to those who lived through these winters. At night, they covered the fire with cinders to preserve a glow until dawn, hoping to avoid the difficult task of starting from scratch in a freezing kitchen. Fuel shortages were a constant anxiety. In times of economic hardship, families could not always afford to buy enough coal. Children collected fallen branches in parks, while the desperate scavenged for coke, the byproduct of coal, around gasworks. Fires that burned on such materials were smoky and weak, but they were better than nothing. For many, the difference between health and illness, between endurance and despair, lay in those flames. Nighttime brought its own rituals. Before bed, families carefully banked the fire. This meant piling small coals over glowing embers and covering them lightly with ash, trapping the heat so that the fire would not burn out completely. In the morning, the hidden core could be stirred back into life. To lose the fire overnight was to face a bitter dawn, with stiff fingers struggling to coax damp kindling into flame while children shivered nearby. Despite these hardships, the fire held a symbolic weight that was almost as important as its practical warmth. In literature and diaries of the period, fireplaces were described as the heart of the home. To see smoke curling from a chimney was to know that life inside continued, however modestly. Fireside gatherings were woven into memory, evenings of reading, sewing, or storytelling illuminated by nothing more than a flickering glow. On damp winter days, the fog mixed with coal smoke to produce the infamous London smog, choking streets and blotting out the sun. Warmth came at the price of health, and every home carried this reminder in its walls, its air, and its weary inhabitants. Still, when winter was at its harshest, when the frost painted feathers across the glass and the streets lay buried in snow, there was no sight more welcome than a coal fire glowing red in the grate. It was a fragile barrier against the cold, a promise of endurance, and a symbol of survival in an age when warmth could never be taken for granted. If the hearth was the heart of the Victorian winter home, then clothing was its armor. Every day, men, women, and children alike stepped out into a world where bitter winds cut through narrow streets, where damp air clung to the body, and where snow often turned to slush beneath their boots. Surviving this season meant building a defense, not of metal or stone, but of wool, flannel, and countless layers of cloth. For women, the process of dressing was elaborate even at the best of times, and winter only increased the number of layers. Against the skin, a woman wore a chemise, usually of cotton or linen, to protect her corset from perspiration. Over this came drawers, or long underpants, and then the corset itself, stiffened with whalebone or steel. Winter did not make the corset optional. In fact, its structure provided some insulation, though not much comfort. The next step was petticoats, several of them quilted or woolen to trap warmth. A working-class woman might own only one or two, patched and mended, until they could no longer be worn. A wealthier woman, by contrast, might layer half a dozen, each chosen for shape as well as warmth. The skirt and bodice followed, made of heavy fabrics such as wool serge or velvet for the fortunate, or cheaper cottons and coarse cloth for the poor. Over all of this came shawls, cloaks, or mantles, often trimmed with fur or lined with flannel. The goal was not only warmth, but also a presentation that met society's strict expectations of modesty and decorum. Accessories were essential. Gloves protected the hands, though they rarely provided much insulation. Bonnets or hats shielded the head, sometimes with woolen hoods or veils underneath. For those with means, a fur muff, a cylinder into which both hands could be slipped, was the height of winter fashion. Diaries describe how, even in unheated carriages, a muff could provide a surprising degree of comfort. But for the poor, such luxuries were unimaginable. A knitted shawl or hand-me-down scarf had to suffice. Men's winter clothing was simpler, but still layered. Against the skin, many wore woolen union suits, one-piece undergarments that covered the body from neck to ankle. Over this came a shirt, waistcoat, and trousers of heavy wool. Jackets or frock coats provided a second layer, and for outdoor wear, greatcoats were common. These were long, thick, and often made of broadcloth, with high collars that could be turned up against the wind. Gloves, scarves, and sturdy boots completed the ensemble. A top hat or bowler remained standard, though in bitter weather, some men wore wool caps under their more fashionable headgear. Children were not spared the tyranny of layers. Boys wore flannel undergarments, woolen trousers, shirts, and jackets, while girls endured miniature versions of their mother's attire: chemises, petticoats, wool dresses, and shawls. For play, many children had only one set of winter clothes, and these were often handed down from older siblings. The weight of the garments restricted movement, and damp hems from snow or puddles often left children chilled. Yet photographs from the era show smiling faces in thick coats and bonnets. Their resilience, a reminder that winter was as much a part of childhood memory as hardship. Wool was the most trusted fabric, prized for its warmth and durability. Flannel, a softer weave of wool, was used for undergarments and night clothes. Cotton was cheaper but less insulating, while silk was reserved for those with wealth, its warmth secondary to its elegance. Fur was highly valued, both for luxury and for genuine protection against cold. Muffs, collars, cuffs, and trimmings of fox, sable, or rabbit signaled status. But even poorer families might use sheepskin or rabbit for linings if they could afford it. The process of keeping these clothes wearable through a long winter was constant work. Mending was a near daily task, particularly for working families. Holes were patched, seams restitched, and worn areas reinforced with whatever scraps were available. Clothing was expensive, and a single coat might serve a child for several years, handed down again when it was outgrown. Diaries and letters from the period frequently mention evenings spent darning socks by the fire, the repetitive labor-forming part of family life. But for all the necessity, Victorian winter clothing was not always practical. Heavy skirts dragged in the snow and became waterlogged. Boots leaked, leaving feet cold and damp. Gloves offered little warmth compared to modern standards, and many people suffered from chilblains, painful swelling and redness of the fingers and toes caused by exposure to cold. Fashion demanded appearances, and for the middle and upper classes, style sometimes took precedence over true comfort. Even indoors, clothing remained essential. Most homes had only 1 or 2 heated rooms, leaving the rest of the house bitterly cold. It was common to see people wearing their outdoor layers indoors, shawls draped across shoulders, and caps or night bonnets kept on even during the day. Bedrooms were rarely heated, so nightclothes had to be substantial. Flannel nightgowns, thick stockings, and bed jackets. Some even wore their day clothes to bed, especially if fuel was scarce. The contrast between rich and poor in winter clothing was stark. For the wealthy, winter was an opportunity to display elegance. Ladies' magazines advertised the latest fashions in fur-rimmed cloaks, velvet gowns, and elaborate bonnets adorned with feathers. Tailors offered gentlemen fine greatcoats lined with silk or cashmere. The poor, meanwhile, relied on charity sales, second-hand shops, or homemade garments. Ragged shawls, patched trousers, and threadbare boots were common sights in working-class neighborhoods. The cold did not spare anyone, but it treated people differently according to their means. Still, whether fine or humble, Victorian winter clothing tells a story of adaptation. Each layer was a defense, each stitch an act of endurance. To dress each morning was to prepare for battle with the season, a battle that had to be fought anew every day until spring. And for those who survived the memory of those layers, the scratch of wool, the weight of cloaks, the smell of damp fabric drying by the fire lingered as part of the rhythm of life in a world where warmth could never be taken for granted. The matter of clothing in a Victorian winter was not simply about fashion or even comfort. It was about survival. And survival in that era depended on small choices made each morning and maintained throughout the day. One of the most pressing problems was footwear. Boots were essential, yet they were often inadequate against snow and slush. Leather soles allowed moisture to seep through, and even the best crafted boots wore thin with constant use. For the poor, boots were sometimes shared between siblings, with children taking turns to wear them to school. Others made do with wooden clogs, which offered durability but little insulation against the cold. Newspaper stuffed into shoes was a common attempt to block drafts and absorb dampness. The wealthy, meanwhile, could afford boots lined with fur or felt, and they had the luxury of multiple pairs so that wet boots could be dried properly before being worn again. Umbrellas and parasols, so commonly associated with the Victorian image, were not of much use in the depths of winter. Instead, cloaks with hoods or large shawls took their place. Some households used oilcloth to waterproof garments, though this was often stiff and uncomfortable. Capes and greatcoats were worn by both men and women, and these garments, while heavy, allowed for freer movement than layers of skirts and petticoats. The riding cloak, for example, with its wide cut and deep hood, was particularly popular for outdoor travel in poor weather. Work dictated variations in clothing as well. A coal miner in the north of England did not dress the same way as a gentleman strolling through Hyde Park. Outdoor laborers, farmers, dock workers, builders faced the worst of the season with only basic protection. Thick woolen jerseys, rough coats, scarves wound tightly around the face, and flat caps pulled low against the wind. The constant dampness of outdoor work meant that clothing rarely dried completely, leaving men chilled even after returning home. Indoor workers, clerks, shop assistants, teachers wore layers appropriate to unheated workplaces, but at least they were spared exposure to snow and rain. Servants had their own struggles, often rising before dawn to work in freezing kitchens, wearing aprons and uniforms that offered little defense against the cold. Nighttime clothing deserves special attention. Bedrooms were almost always unheated, and even in the wealthiest homes, only the sick or elderly were allowed fires upstairs. For most Victorians, going to bed in winter meant bundling up in thick nightgowns, stockings, and sometimes even gloves. Flannel was the favored fabric for nightwear, prized for its warmth and softness. Men wore long nightshirts, often belted at the waist, while women had high-necked gowns that reached to the ankles. Bed jackets, short, quilted garments worn over night clothes, added another layer of protection. Children, too, were bundled in nightdresses or long woolen sleepers. Caps or bonnets were worn to keep the head warm, a habit that today might seem strange but was once regarded as essential. And then there was the matter of laundering. In the damp and smoky air of a Victorian city, clothing became dirty quickly. Washing, however, was a demanding task, especially in winter. Water had to be heated over the fire, soap was harsh, and drying clothes in cold weather was a trial in itself. Indoor drying left garments stiff with soot, while outdoor drying risked them freezing solid on the line. As a result, clothing was washed infrequently, and undergarments, intended to protect outer layers from sweat and dirt, were critical in extending the life of more expensive garments. Health concerns also shaped winter clothing. The Victorians were acutely aware of ailments caused by cold. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and influenza claimed many lives, particularly among the very young and the elderly. Doctors frequently advised patients to keep their chests and extremities well covered. Woolen chest warmers, sometimes called hug-me-tights, were worn beneath clothing. Flannel belts were wrapped around the stomach to prevent chills. For women, pregnancy in winter carried additional risks, and garments were adjusted to allow both modesty and warmth. Advertisements in newspapers promoted health vests and sanitary flannels that promised protection against colds, though their actual effectiveness was often questionable. At the same time, Victorian society attached moral significance to dress. To appear poorly clothed in public was seen not only as a mark of poverty, but also as a failing of character. Charitable organizations therefore placed great emphasis on providing winter garments for the needy, especially children. Reports from the period describe clothing drives that distributed coats, shawls, and boots, sometimes second-hand, to families unable to afford them. These donations could mean the difference between enduring winter with relative safety or succumbing to illness brought on by exposure. Fashion, of course, could not be ignored, even in the depths of winter. The upper classes followed trends reported in magazines like The Queen or Godey's Ladies' Book. Winter fashions called for darker colors, rich fabrics, and elaborate trimmings. Cloaks lined with fur, bonnets decorated with velvet ribbons, and gloves of fine kid leather were all symbols of refinement. Men, too, were expected to dress elegantly with tailored greatcoats, polished boots, and carefully chosen cravats. For the middle classes, emulating these styles was a way of asserting social respectability, even if it required significant sacrifice. The poor, meanwhile, often dressed in patched or outdated garments, but even they strove for neatness when possible, reflecting the widespread belief that appearance reflected morality. In some, Victorian winter clothing was a constant negotiation between necessity and appearance, between survival and respectability. Each garment told a story of the household that produced it, of the hands that mended it, and of the body it protected against the season's relentless cold. The image of a Victorian street in midwinter is incomplete without these layers. Men hurrying along with greatcoats buttoned up to their chins, women clutching shawls tighter against the wind, children dragging damp hems through the slush, servants carrying coal buckets with scarves tied over their heads, each figure bundled, burdened, yet carrying on, moving through the cold with the dignity and determination demanded by their age. And when at last spring arrived, and the heavy cloaks and woolen petticoats were set aside, the relief was profound. The simple act of moving without weight, of feeling sun on one's face without a bonnet or muff, reminded Victorians of what they had endured. Their clothing had been both a burden and a shield, a reminder that winter was never to be taken lightly, and that survival required not just strength, but preparation stitched into every layer. If clothing was the outer armor against the Victorian winter, food was the inner fuel. Keeping warm depended as much on what one ate as on what one wore. Yet here, too, class and circumstance created vastly different experiences. For the wealthy, winter offered an opportunity to indulge in hearty meals that showcased abundance. Dining tables groaned beneath roasts of beef, mutton, and venison. Game birds, pheasant, grouse, partridge appeared frequently, supplied by country estates where hunting remained a seasonal pastime. These meats were accompanied by root vegetables that stored well, carrots, turnips, and parsnips, often roasted in dripping or served in stews. Potatoes were a constant, boiled or mashed, and bread, always freshly baked, was never absent. Desserts, too, reflected the season. Mince pies, rich with dried fruit and suet, were staples during the Christmas period. Plum puddings, soaked in brandy and steamed for hours, were prepared weeks in advance and carefully stored. Candied fruits, nuts, and spiced cakes filled sideboards, while imported delicacies, such as oranges or figs, appeared as marks of wealth. Even alcohol played its role. Mulled wine, hot punch, and strong ales were considered both festive and medicinal, believed to warm the blood and stave off colds. In middle-class homes, meals were less extravagant, but still nourishing. A joint of meat, often stretched across several days, was the centerpiece. Monday's roast became Tuesday's cold cuts, which in turn flavored Wednesday's soup. The thrifty housewife knew how to extract the maximum value from each purchase. Root vegetables and cabbage filled out plates, while oatmeal, bread, and porridge formed the staples of breakfast and supper. Preserving food was a necessary skill, and pickles, jams, and chutneys filled pantries, ensuring variety even when fresh produce was scarce. For the poor, however, winter diets were meager and monotonous. Bread was often the mainstay, accompanied by weak tea, or, when possible, dripping saved from a neighbor's roast. Porridge or gruel, made from oats or barley, provided warmth, if little else. Potatoes were cheap and filling, but when prices rose, even these could be out of reach. Meat was rare, appearing perhaps at Christmas in the form of a small piece of beef or pork. More often, scraps of offal, hearts, livers, tripe were all that could be afforded. Street markets sold block ornaments, hardened drippings, and fat trimmings that could be melted into broth. Hunger was common, and malnutrition, especially among children, contributed to the high rates of illness in the season. Fuel shortages compounded the difficulty of food preparation. A family with little coal could not afford to keep fires burning long enough for stews or roasts. Boiling water for tea or gruel might be the limit of their cooking. Some relied on communal bakehouses to cook larger meals, or on soup kitchens organized by charities and churches. Reports from London in the 1850s describe lines of families waiting with pitchers and bowls to receive ladles of broth thickened with barley or peas. These institutions offered not just sustenance, but also warmth, as they allowed the poor to escape the biting wind for a few moments. Seasonal rhythms shaped food availability for all classes. Winter meant the absence of fresh greens, save for hardy cabbages and winter kale. Apples, stored carefully in cellars, might last until early spring, but most fruit came in dried, candied, or preserved forms. Butter and milk were harder to keep from spoiling, and so cheese often took their place. In coastal areas, fish offered variety: salted herring, dried cod, and smoked haddock. Inland, though, such fare was more expensive. Eating was not just a matter of sustenance, but of warmth itself. The act of holding a hot bowl of stew or sipping a steaming mug of tea offered comfort against the season. Meals became anchors in the day, times when the family gathered near the hearth, if they were fortunate enough to have one. In the Victorian imagination, winter was inseparable from food rituals. At a time when daylight was brief and the cold pressed on every surface of the home, meals became a source of light, warmth, and togetherness. Beyond the daily struggle to keep hunger at bay, winter food carried symbolic meaning, marking celebrations, reinforcing social bonds, and offering psychological comfort during months of hardship. Of all winter celebrations, none carried greater weight than Christmas. By the mid-19th century, Christmas had undergone something of a revival in Britain, largely thanks to writers like Charles Dickens. His works, especially A Christmas Carol, reshaped public notions of the holiday as a season of generosity, family unity, and shared meals. The Christmas feast was the crowning moment of the season. For the wealthy, this meant tables heaped with roast goose, turkey, or beef, surrounded by dishes of potatoes, roasted chestnuts, and spiced red cabbage. Brightly colored jellies, molded into ornate shapes, decorated the table, alongside mincemeat pies filled with suet, raisins, currants, and spices. At the center of it all was the plum pudding, a dense, steamed concoction, heavy with dried fruits, nuts, suet, and brandy. Weeks before Christmas, families would gather to mix the pudding, each person taking a turn to stir while making a wish. On the day itself, it was carried proudly to the table, doused in brandy, and set aflame, a blazing symbol of cheer against the darkness of December. For middle-class households, the same rituals were observed in simpler forms. A roast might be smaller, the pies fewer, and the pudding less elaborate, but the effort was no less sincere. For working families, Christmas dinner might be the only time of year when meat was plentiful. Charities distributed tickets for affordable holiday dinners, and soup kitchens provided special portions. Even the poorest families might scrape together enough for a small joint of beef or pork, accompanied by potatoes and a pudding sweetened with treacle instead of dried fruits. The meal, however modest, carried enormous emotional weight, marking a moment of celebration amidst a season of struggle. Boxing Day, the day after Christmas, also revolved around food. Traditionally, this was when wealthier families distributed boxes of leftovers, gifts, and coins to servants and the poor. For many working people, it was the one day when generosity from above could be relied upon. A slice of cake or meat pie, gifted from the household where one worked, could brighten an otherwise meager winter. Food alone was not enough to keep spirits raised through the long, cold evenings. Warm drinks, simple, inexpensive, and soothing, became essential. Tea was the national staple, strong, black, and served with milk and sugar when possible. It warmed hands as well as bodies. For the middle class, afternoon tea provided a daily ritual, a pause in the day when the family gathered for conversation, cakes, and sandwiches. For the poor, tea was more basic, but no less comforting, a hot liquid that filled the stomach, even if the leaves had been reused several times. Other winter beverages held festive associations. Mulled wine, steeped with cinnamon, cloves, and citrus peel, was served at gatherings, the fragrance alone lifting moods. Hot punch, made with rum, sugar, lemon, and boiling water, was popular at winter parties. Wassail, a spiced ale or cider, was tied to older traditions of communal celebration. Groups would go door to door, singing and offering a drink from a communal bowl in exchange for gifts of food or coin, a practice that lingered in rural areas into the Victorian age. For children, hot milk with nutmeg or a touch of treacle was common, offering comfort before bed. Cocoa, introduced in the late 18th century, gained popularity in the 19th as a wholesome alternative to alcohol. Advertisements promoted it as strengthening and healthful, ideal for cold nights. Meals in winter carried a significance beyond nutrition. They reinforced family bonds, provided structure to the day, and served as a form of storytelling. Sitting together around the fire, families might recount the day's events, recite verses, or share folk tales while eating simple suppers of bread and broth. In wealthier households, dining was also about display, the arrangement of dishes, the quality of silverware, and the presence of imported foods such as tropical fruits demonstrated prosperity. A Victorian hostess took pride in presenting a table that reflected refinement and abundance, even in the darkest season. Yet the psychological comfort of food was universal. Even among the poor, a bowl of hot stew could transform a bleak evening. Contemporary reports often noted how charitable soup kitchens provided not only calories, but also dignity. Families who otherwise dined on stale bread could enjoy, even briefly, the sensation of a proper meal. Underlying all these rituals was the practical necessity of preservation. Without refrigeration, Victorians relied on time-tested methods to stretch supplies through the cold months. Salting, pickling, drying, and storing in cellars were essential skills. Root cellars kept carrots, turnips, and potatoes edible for months. Apples were wrapped in straw and stored in cool, dark rooms. Meat was salted, smoked, or preserved in jars of fat. Jam making in the summer ensured that berries could brighten winter breakfasts. Pickled onions, gherkins, and chutneys added flavor to otherwise bland fare. Even ice itself became a tool of preservation. Wealthy households sometimes purchased blocks of ice cut from frozen lakes and stored in ice houses insulated with straw. These blocks could last well into spring, allowing for a wider variety of dishes. For most people, however, preservation relied on simplicity, eating what the season allowed and making do when supplies ran low. Despite all the traditions and strategies, hunger was never far away. Winter brought higher food prices, and poor harvests meant scarcity. Newspapers carried grim accounts of families unable to buy bread, their children weakened by lack of nourishment. In Ireland, even decades after the Great Famine, winter still carried the dread of want. Workhouses offered meals, but at a heavy social and psychological cost. Soup kitchens were life-saving, yet they also reminded families of their dependence on charity. Malnutrition weakened resistance to disease, making illnesses like pneumonia more deadly. In this sense, food was not just a comfort, but a matter of survival. Yet amidst these hardships, food retained its symbolic power. A roast goose at Christmas, however small, symbolized plenty. A steaming mug of tea could calm the nerves and provide warmth when fuel was scarce. Even a crust of bread shared among children carried the reassurance of care. Victorian writers often highlighted the emotional resonance of meals. Dickens returned repeatedly to scenes of families gathered around tables, finding joy in modest suppers. These moments stood as symbols of resilience, proof that even in the coldest season, human beings sought connection through food. By the time spring began to stir, larders were nearly bare. Root vegetables sprouted or rotted, apples softened, and salted meats grew tough. Meals became plainer, and anticipation for fresh greens and milk returned. But the endurance of winter meals, from lavish roasts to humble bowls of gruel, reflected the Victorian ability to adapt. Food, in its many forms, was not just nourishment. It was warmth, ritual, and memory. Each winter meal, however grand or meager, carried with it the weight of survival and the promise of brighter days to come. The Victorian winter shaped not only meals and celebrations, but also the rhythm of daily work and learning. For most people, the cold season was not a time of rest, but one of greater hardship. Short days, limited light, icy streets, and freezing workplaces made survival an effort that stretched from dawn to dusk. Industrial Britain never stopped for the weather. Factories continued to run, mines continued to dig, and railways continued to expand, regardless of frost or snow. For those employed in these industries, winter only made dangerous conditions more severe. Factory laborers rose before daylight, often trudging through snow or rain to reach vast, unheated buildings. Once inside, the air was thick with steam, smoke, or lint, depending on the trade. In textile mills, windows were kept closed to prevent threads from breaking, leaving workers in stale, humid air. In match factories, phosphorus fumes lingered. In mines, dripping water froze into icy puddles, and ventilation shafts let in bitter drafts. Protective clothing was minimal. A wool cap, a shawl, or an extra layer of coarse cloth had to suffice. Boots wore thin quickly, leaving feet damp and cold. Workers kept moving to stay warm, but still shivered at their stations. Frostbitten fingers were common, as were respiratory illnesses that spread more easily in winter. For outdoor laborers, the hardships were even harsher. Builders, carters, and agricultural workers endured long hours in freezing winds. Roads became slippery with ice, making horse-drawn wagons treacherous to guide. Farmers worked with numb hands to feed livestock, break ice on water troughs, and repair damaged barns. In cities, night soil men, those who collected human waste from cesspits, still did their rounds in all weather, hauling heavy loads through frozen streets. Winter was especially cruel for women and children, who made up a significant portion of the Victorian workforce. Children as young as 6 or 7 walked in darkness to factories or workshops. In mines, some still worked as trappers, sitting alone for hours underground to open and close ventilation doors. The cold seeped into their bones, and poor nutrition left them with little strength to resist illness. Girls in textile factories often worked with wet hands, winding damp threads in chilly rooms. Laundry workers hauled heavy, steaming loads that quickly turned to ice when carried outdoors. Match girls, many of them teenagers, endured long hours in drafty workshops. Women who sewed shirts or made lace at home had no break from the season either. Their workrooms were small, unheated, and dimly lit, and their pay depended on how much they could finish. Widows and single mothers, especially, struggled in winter. If illness kept them from working, hunger quickly followed. Many were forced to seek aid from charitable societies or parish relief during the coldest months, and some turned to workhouses where they could at least count on shelter and food. Education in winter was its own battle. For middle and upper-class children, schools were often well maintained, with fires burning in hearths and lamps providing light on dark afternoons. Lessons continued much as they did in summer, though snowball fights and sledding on school grounds added some seasonal excitement. For working-class children, the picture was different. Many attended ragged schools, institutions run by charities to provide free education. These schools were often housed in old buildings with poor heating and ventilation. Pupils sat in their coats and shawls, their breath visible in the frosty air. Slates grew brittle with cold, ink froze in wells, and numb fingers struggled to hold chalk. Attendance was irregular in winter. Some children missed weeks at a time, kept at home to help their families. Boys might haul coal or sell firewood, while girls took in sewing or cared for younger siblings. A few earned pennies by sweeping snow from shop fronts or delivering hot food to factory workers. For parents struggling to pay rent or buy food, survival took precedence over education. Even when children managed to attend, the journey was arduous. Streets were slick with ice, and thin boots quickly soaked through. Many walked miles on empty stomachs, arriving at school already exhausted. Teachers, aware of their pupils' hardships, sometimes allowed lessons to pause for a cup of hot milk or broth when it could be afforded. The shortness of daylight shaped winter schedules. Factories relied on gaslight to keep machines running before sunrise and after sunset. At home, families lit candles or oil lamps earlier in the afternoon, straining household budgets. Many workers left home in darkness and returned in darkness, seeing little of the sun for weeks at a time. Sundays offered a brief respite. Churches provided both warmth and structure, with morning and evening services, drawing families indoors. For some, church was the warmest place they entered all week, as coal fires were maintained to keep congregations comfortable. Charity teas and Sunday schools also gave children relief, with hot drinks and lessons offered freely. But for the poor, even Sundays could not erase the hardships of work. Many women still took in laundry, mending, or washing on the Sabbath, knowing that income lost could mean hunger. Winter also meant seasonal changes in work. Agricultural laborers often faced reduced hours once harvest ended, leaving them scrambling for employment in towns. Some turned to winter trades, like chopping firewood, clearing snow, or selling fuel on street corners. Others migrated temporarily to cities in search of factory jobs. In urban areas, casual laborers, dock workers, porters, builders suffered from lack of demand during frosty months. When ships were delayed by storms, dock workers went without pay. When building projects paused for ice and snow, bricklayers and carpenters found themselves idle. Unemployment rose sharply, and with it, reliance on parish relief and soup kitchens. Charities stepped in to provide winter employment schemes, such as stone breaking or road mending for men in need. These jobs were hard and poorly paid, but they offered at least some relief from complete destitution. Still, many families endured weeks of uncertainty, never knowing if the next day would bring wages or hunger. If work and school demanded perseverance in the winter months, so too did the simple act of traveling between them. Streets, vehicles, and the very air conspired against those who had little choice but to face the elements each day. The growing sprawl of Victorian towns meant that many workers lived miles from their place of employment. Each day they walked along frozen cobblestones, over slippery bridges, or through muddy, half-frozen lanes. Thin boots, patched and worn, soaked through within minutes, leaving feet wet for the rest of the day. Even those fortunate enough to have clogs or thicker footwear found them treacherous on ice. Horse-drawn omnibuses rattled along main roads, their passengers packed close for warmth, but fares, while modest, were still beyond the daily means of many laborers. These vehicles were also unreliable in heavy snow. Horses slipped on icy streets, wheels sank into frozen ruts, and services were delayed or canceled outright. For the wealthy, private carriages offered more comfortable passage, with thick rugs and foot warmers, but for the majority, travel was a test of endurance. Railways, the pride of the industrial age, brought both promise and peril in winter. Trains kept to timetables whenever possible, but snowdrifts blocked lines, and frost warped tracks. Commuters huddled in unheated third-class carriages, their breath misting in the cold, while wealthier passengers enjoyed compartments with small stoves or hot water flasks. For rural families, trains also provided access to seasonal markets, allowing them to sell firewood, produce, or livestock, though the journeys were long and grueling. Children walking to school faced particular hazards. Streets were poorly lit, and fog made it difficult to see carts or carriages approaching. Accidents increased in winter, with children slipping beneath wheels or being struck in the gloom. Parents worried, but had little choice. Education was vital, and work awaited them too. The cold did not just sap strength, it invited illness. Bronchitis, pneumonia, influenza, and tuberculosis spread rapidly in crowded, poorly heated spaces. Factories and workshops, filled with damp air and dust, were breeding grounds for respiratory disease. Children, already weakened by malnutrition, often succumbed quickly to winter fevers. Medical care was expensive, and hospitals were not easily accessible. For the poor, treatment often meant home remedies, mustard poultices for chest colds, goose fat rubbed on the skin to keep out the chill, or hot onion broth to ease coughs. While some remedies provided relief, many were ineffective, and mortality rose sharply in winter months. Frostbite and chilblains were common among those who spent long hours outdoors. Red, swollen fingers and toes became infected, sometimes leading to more serious illness. For dock workers or builders handling icy tools and ropes, the pain was constant. Children who went without proper shoes developed sores that never fully healed. The mentally draining aspect of the season was also felt. Workers who left home in darkness and returned in darkness described feeling weighed down, exhausted not only by labor but by the endless gloom. For many Victorians, the lack of sunlight carried a heaviness they could not name. Today, we might recognize it as seasonal depression, but at the time it was simply part of life. Despite the difficulties, winter also brought small measures of relief, especially through community and tradition. For many, shared hardship created bonds that lightened the season's burdens. Factories sometimes permitted shortened hours on Christmas Eve or gave small bonuses of coal or food to their workers. A foreman might allow a brazier to burn in the corner of a workshop, though this was the exception rather than the rule. Some mines collected funds for sick workers, ensuring their families had a little to eat during the coldest weeks. Schools also found ways to bring comfort. Charity groups delivered hot meals, bread, soup, or porridge to ragged schools. For children accustomed to hunger, even a single warm dish each day could be the difference between endurance and despair. Teachers often contributed out of their own wages to keep fires burning in classrooms. At home, families clung to rituals that gave warmth beyond the physical. Sitting close together around a fire, telling stories, or singing songs helped pass the long evenings. Children played with simple winter amusements, rolling hoops through the snow, sliding on frozen ponds, or carving small sleds from wood scraps. Poor though they were, these moments carved out joy amidst struggle. Community gatherings also carried people through the season. Chapels and churches organized teas, concerts, and charity drives. Even for those with little faith, the gatherings offered light, music, and companionship, a temporary escape from the cold grind of daily survival. Perhaps nowhere was the contrast of Victorian life more evident than in the way classes experienced winter. For the wealthy, country houses glowed with multiple fires, heavy curtains, and thick carpets. Carriages brought them to balls and dinners, their cloaks lined with fur. For the poor, meanwhile, the same season meant numb fingers at work, thin broth at supper, and shivering nights in damp rooms. Yet even among the privileged, winter was not without inconvenience. Frost on carriage steps caused slips. Snow made hunting trips treacherous, and drafty mansions required a small army of servants to keep warm. But discomfort was temporary. Comfort was always within reach. For the poor, discomfort was not temporary. It was a constant companion. The weight of the season was measured in sickness, hunger, and exhaustion. Winter was survived, not enjoyed. When the season reached its deepest cold, people's lives contracted further still. Days were mapped by essential needs, rising before dawn, walking miles through the frost, laboring long hours, returning in darkness. The rhythm was relentless, yet it carried a strange steadiness. People endured because they had no choice, because generations before them had done the same, and because spring eventually would come. Winter in the Victorian era was not only a season of discomfort, it was a season of danger. The cold did not simply chill the bones. It invited illness, magnified weakness, and shortened lives. For the poor, whose lives already teetered on the edge of survival, winter often tipped the balance. Victorian Britain was a world where contagious diseases thrived. Overcrowded housing, polluted air, and inadequate nutrition left people vulnerable year-round. But in winter, these risks multiplied. Damp and cold weakened immune systems, allowing infections to spread more easily. Children, crammed into underheated schools and playing in icy streets, brought illnesses home. Entire families would cough through the long nights, their fevers rising as frost crept along the windows. Smallpox and scarlet fever also cast their shadow. While smallpox vaccination existed, access was uneven, and outbreaks still occurred. Scarlet fever struck children most often, spreading rapidly in close quarters, leaving families devastated in its wake. Winter, when people gathered indoors for warmth, made such outbreaks more likely. For many households, doctors were a luxury. A single visit could cost more than a week's wages for a laborer, and medicines were similarly expensive. As a result, most families turned first to home remedies, some rooted in tradition, some in superstition, and a few with genuine therapeutic effect. Goose fat rubbed on the chest was a common treatment for coughs, believed to seal out the cold and ease breathing. Mustard poultices, hot and stinging, were spread across the chest to draw out illness. Herbal teas, made from elderflower, peppermint, or thyme, were brewed in cramped kitchens, offering both comfort and mild relief. Onions, garlic, and vinegar were used in various concoctions. A sliced onion placed in a sick room was thought to absorb disease from the air. Warm broth, when available, gave both hydration and nourishment to those unable to stomach solid food. Superstition lingered as well. Some families placed charms by a sick child's bed or consulted local healers. Remedies might include wearing amulets or burning herbs to ward off bad air. Though ineffective, these practices provided reassurance in a world where medical knowledge was limited and fear was great. When home remedies failed, families might turn to the apothecary. These shops provided powders, tinctures, and syrups at a lower cost than a physician's visit. Bottles lined the shelves, promising relief for coughs, fevers, and aches. Many apothecaries mixed their own compounds, drawing on traditional recipes. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was widely sold for coughs, sleeplessness, and pain. While effective in dulling discomfort, it was addictive and dangerous, often administered even to children. Cough syrups, laced with alcohol, morphine, or chloroform, were popular, providing temporary ease at the cost of long-term harm. Yet to the suffering poor, such relief was worth the risk. Families with only a few pennies to spare would stretch a bottle across a household, dosing each child sparingly to quiet their cries through the night. For those who could afford it, doctors offered a higher level of care, though by modern standards, it was still limited. Germ theory was only beginning to gain traction in the mid to late Victorian period, and antiseptic practices were not yet widespread in the earlier decades. Physicians relied on observation, listening to the chest, and prescribing rest, warmth, and tonics. Tonics often included iron, cod liver oil, or quinine. Wealthier patients might be sent to the seaside for fresh air, believed to be a cure for weak lungs. Poorer patients had no such option. Their treatments were limited to whatever could be managed at home. Hospitals, where they existed, were intimidating places, overcrowded, underfunded, and sometimes rife with infection. They were often seen as a last resort. Many families preferred to keep the sick at home, where care could at least be personal and familiar. The connection between labor and winter illness was direct. Men working long shifts outdoors or in damp, unheated factories were at constant risk of respiratory disease. Women, tasked with washing clothes in icy water, often suffered from washerwoman's frostbite, their hands cracked and raw, infections spreading through the wounds. children sent to sweep chimneys or work in mines breathed in soot and dust, their small bodies more vulnerable to illness. In textile mills, where humidity was artificially raised to aid production, workers endured damp, lung-chilling air that made coughs spread rapidly. Once illness took hold, few could afford to rest. Missing work meant lost wages, and lost wages meant hunger. Many forced themselves to labor while ill, worsening their condition and spreading disease to others. The cycle was cruel and unrelenting. Coal funds, organized by churches or local benefactors, supplied families with small amounts of fuel to keep fires burning. Medical charities also existed, offering treatment at reduced or no cost. Voluntary hospitals sometimes opened their doors to the poor, though beds were limited and admission selective. Mothers with sick children might plead with charitable societies for assistance, receiving bottles of medicine or a doctor's visit arranged through donations. While such relief made a difference, it was uneven and unreliable. A family might receive coal one year and be overlooked the next. Survival was often a matter of luck as much as endurance. Illness in winter was not only a physical burden, but an emotional one. Families watched helplessly as fevers rose, unable to provide more than warmth and whispered comfort. Parents carried the fear of losing children, a fear all too often realized. Death rates among infants and young children soared in winter, their small bodies unable to fight infection. Grief was a familiar presence. Funerals became more common in the cold months, processions winding through snow-dusted streets. Neighbors gathered to offer comfort, yet everyone knew it might be their turn next. Even for survivors, the weight of illness lingered. Weak lungs or damaged health carried into adulthood, shortening lives and limiting opportunity. Winter left its mark, not just in mortality, but in chronic debility. For Victorians, illness in winter was not an exception, it was expected. Each year brought fresh struggles, and each family braced themselves for the toll. The cold months demanded vigilance, resourcefulness, and above all, endurance. Yet within this grim reality, there were moments of resilience. Mothers brewed remedies late into the night. Neighbors shared coal or broth with those worse off. Children, even while coughing, still played in the snow when they could, their laughter briefly lifting the heaviness of the season. Winter was cruel, but Victorians faced it with the determination that defined their age. Illness might stalk every home, but life, in its stubborn persistence, carried on. Winter in Victorian Britain was not only a battle against the cold, but also a battle to keep fed. The diet of ordinary families, already meager in the best of times, grew thinner as frosts set in and fresh produce vanished from markets. To eat in the cold months required planning, resourcefulness, and often sacrifice. For most working-class households, food was never abundant. Bread and potatoes formed the staples, supplemented by whatever could be afforded. Meat, fresh vegetables, and dairy were luxuries, appearing only occasionally on the table of the poor. In winter, scarcity became acute. Fields lay dormant, gardens produced little, and fishing was limited by stormy seas. The food that did appear in markets was often more expensive, as transport slowed and supply tightened. Families relied on storage. Root vegetables, such as turnips, parsnips, and carrots, could be kept for months in cellars or outdoor pits. Cabbages, hardy against the cold, often lasted into winter, though they grew limp and tough. Apples, if carefully wrapped and stored, might remain edible for weeks, offering a rare sweetness in a season of monotony. Bread was the foundation of the Victorian diet. For the poor, it was consumed in enormous quantities, sometimes making up more than half of daily calories. In winter, bread was paired with dripping, the fat collected from cooked meat, spread thinly to add flavor and sustenance. Families often lived on bread, potatoes, and weak tea for days at a time, especially during the harshest weeks of January and February. Yet even these staples were not guaranteed. A poor harvest or rising prices could leave families unable to afford sufficient quantities. Bread riots were not unheard of earlier in the century, and though less common in the later Victorian years, hunger remained a persistent threat. Meat was a prized rarity. For wealthier households, winter brought roasted joints of beef, mutton, and pork, filling kitchens with warmth and aroma. For the poor, meat was more likely to appear in scraps, a bone bought cheaply from the butcher to flavor broth, or offal, liver, tripe, or kidney, sold at lower prices. Street markets sometimes offered cheap cuts, though freshness was questionable. Families made the most of what they could buy, stretching even the smallest portion into soups or stews that could feed many mouths. Bones were boiled repeatedly until they yielded no more flavor, the resulting liquid sipped like nourishment itself. Preserved meats were another option. Salted pork or bacon could last through the winter months, though they were often heavily salted to the point of toughness. Smoked herrings, known as kippers, offered both protein and flavor, filling working-class homes with their pungent scent. While fresh greens were scarce, certain vegetables sustained families through the winter. Turnips, leeks, and onions appeared frequently in cooking, lending body to broths and stews. Pickling and preserving were essential. Families who could manage it put aside jars of pickled vegetables in autumn, cucumbers, beets, and onions, to brighten winter meals. Jam, when sugar could be afforded, was made from summer berries and spread sparingly on bread during the dark months. For many working-class homes, however, such luxuries were rare. Preserving required not only foresight but also resources, jars, sugar, vinegar, that many families could not spare. If there was one dish that defined winter eating, it was soup. In cramped kitchens across Britain, pots simmered for hours, filled with whatever could be found. A bone, a handful of vegetables, stale bread crusts, all went into the pot, transforming scraps into something filling. Tea was the universal comfort. Even in the poorest households, a pot of weak black tea was brewed daily, its bitterness softened with sugar when available. Milk was added in wealthier homes, but for the poor it was often omitted, too costly to waste. For children, water was sometimes flavored with treacle or watered-down milk. Beer and ale were common among adults, considered safer than water in some areas where sanitation was poor. In the depths of winter, hot beer flavored with spices or ginger was consumed as both drink and remedy. Wealthier families indulged in richer comforts, hot chocolate, mulled wine, and puddings filled with dried fruits and suet. These festive treats marked holidays and gatherings, a stark contrast to the plain fare of the working class. The winter diet of the poor was often inadequate in both calories and nutrition. Deficiencies were common, particularly among children. Rickets, caused by lack of vitamin D and worsened by limited sunlight, left many with bowed legs and stunted growth. Scurvy, though better known as a sailor's disease, appeared on land as well, especially among those who could not afford fruits, or fresh vegetables. Weakened by poor diet, many fell prey to illness more easily. A child weakened by hunger was less able to fight off measles or influenza. Adults, already drained from long hours of labor, struggled through the season on bread and tea alone. The stark divide between classes was perhaps most visible at the table. While the poor struggled with bread crusts and thin broth, the wealthy dined on roasts, puddings, and exotic imports, oranges, bananas, and pineapples, shipped from abroad. It staved the tables of the upper classes, bright reminders of a global empire. Cookbooks of the era reveal this contrast. Middle-class manuals offered elaborate winter recipes, from minced pies to boiled hams, assuming access to ingredients and servants. Working-class families relied instead on oral tradition, passing down recipes for broth and gruel, eking out what little they had. This divide was not lost on observers of the time. Social reformers wrote passionately about hunger in the slums, contrasting it with the excesses of wealthy banquets. Charles Dickens, through his novels, made the empty plates of the poor a symbol of broader inequality. Despite scarcity, meals held meaning. Families gathered around the hearth, sharing what little they had. Even a crust of bread, dipped in broth, became a communal act, binding families together against the season's hardships. Festive occasions, though modest, were celebrated with food. Christmas in poor households might feature a small piece of meat, carefully saved for the day, or a pudding made from scraps and suet. The anticipation of such meals provided hope, a reminder that even in deprivation, moments of joy could be found. Children cherished the rare treat of sweets, a boiled sugar candy, perhaps bought for a halfpenny at a local shop. These small indulgences lingered in memory, bright spots in otherwise lean months. Food in Victorian winter was never simply about eating. It was about endurance, finding ways to stretch the smallest amount into enough to keep going. Mothers skipped meals so children could eat. Fathers went hungry after long shifts, silently ensuring their families had the larger share. Hunger was an ever-present companion. It gnawed at stomachs and haunted thoughts, yet it did not extinguish the will to survive. Victorians endured, scraping through the season on bread, broth, and determination. And when spring finally came, with its promise of fresh greens and lighter days, the relief was profound. But winter always returned, and with it the memory of empty plates and the taste of survival. Winter in Victorian Britain was as much a struggle with hunger as with the cold. For the poor, especially, food was never abundant, and the dark months made it scarcer still. Winter in Victorian Britain was not just a season of cold and hunger. It was also a season of sickness. The most common complaint was the simplest, the common cold. Without warm clothing or heated rooms, colds spread quickly, moving from child to parent, from factory to schoolhouse. A blocked nose, a sore throat, and the endless cough became part of daily life. Few families escaped them, but often colds developed into something more serious. Bronchitis was widespread, particularly among the working class, where damp homes and smoky air weakened the lungs. At a time when antibiotics did not exist, even what we might now consider a treatable infection could be fatal. The cold months also brought their own peculiar troubles. Chilblains, painful red swellings caused by cold, damp conditions, were common among children and those who worked outdoors. Fingers, toes, and ears burned and itched with the condition, and there was little relief beyond rubbing in goose grease or warming the hands at the fire. Rheumatism plagued adults, particularly those who labored in damp factories or fields. Aching joints worsened with the season, leaving many unable to work. For families who lived on the edge of poverty, illness meant more than discomfort. It meant lost wages and hunger. Doctors were expensive, so most families treated sickness at home. Children with fevers might be wrapped in cold cloths or made to sip vinegar water. Some remedies worked, others did little, but in the absence of medical care, they offered comfort and hope. A visit from a doctor was rare for working families, reserved for the very worst cases. Medical care required money, and many hesitated until sickness was far advanced. Even then, doctors had limited tools: bleeding, purging, or the prescription of tonics. Some treatments did more harm than good. Hospitals were places of last resort, feared for their association with death. For most of the poor, illness was borne at home, with family and neighbors providing care as best they could. Winter was a season of high mortality. Cold weather, poor diet, and overcrowded housing created the perfect conditions for disease to thrive. Influenza outbreaks swept through towns and villages, sometimes taking thousands of lives. Tuberculosis, the great scourge of the 19th century, was worsened by the damp, and many wasted away slowly through the dark months. For families, death was an ever-present shadow. Children were especially vulnerable. In some districts, few families escaped the loss of at least one child. Burials in frozen ground added to the hardship as grave diggers struggled to break the icy earth. Yet mourning itself became part of winter life. Black ribbons tied, funeral processions trudging through snow. Still, there was resilience. Families shared remedies, neighbors checked in on the sick, and communities sometimes pooled funds to pay for coal or medicine. Religious faith offered comfort, with prayers said for healing. And always, people endured. Each cough, each fever, each long night of watching over a sick child became part of the cycle of Victorian winter. For the wealthy, illness was softened by warm fires, nourishing meals, and attentive doctors. But even they were not spared entirely. Disease respected no class, though its burden fell heaviest on the poor. To live through a Victorian winter was to live with the knowledge that sickness might come. Yet, alongside fear was determination. Families fought illness with what they had: warm blankets, hot drinks, simple remedies, and steadfast care. And when spring finally returned, with fresh air and longer days, the relief was felt in the body as much as in the heart. Surviving another winter meant more than enduring cold. It meant overcoming sickness and stepping once more into the light of health and hope. Even in the grip of winter, Victorians found ways to gather, to laugh, and to celebrate. Life was not only hardship and work, it was also marked by moments of joy and tradition. Festivals, holidays, and community gatherings helped people endure the coldest months. They lit candles against the darkness, shared food and song, and reminded one another that winter, too, held its own kind of beauty. The season's festivities began with Advent in late November, leading up to the great celebration of Christmas. Then came the new year with its promise of renewal. Twelfth Night in early January marked the formal end of the holiday season. For some communities, Candlemas in February, with its processions and blessings, signaled the slow turning toward spring. These milestones punctuated the long winter, giving structure and anticipation to days otherwise heavy with gloom. For Victorians, who lived so closely with the rhythms of nature, such celebrations brought comfort and meaning. No holiday was more important than Christmas. By the mid-19th century, it had grown into the season's centerpiece, a mixture of religious observance, family reunion, and cultural tradition. The Victorians gave us many customs still familiar today. Christmas trees, popularized by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, stood in parlors decorated with candles, fruits, and paper ornaments. Cards were exchanged, bearing snowy scenes and sentimental verses. Crackers were pulled with a bang, spilling trinkets and paper crowns. But at its heart, Christmas was about family. Relatives traveled, sometimes long distances, to gather under one roof. A roaring fire warmed the hearth, while kitchens bustled with preparations for feasts of roast goose or beef, plum pudding, and mince pies. After the meal, games were played, songs were sung, and stories were told. Moments of laughter that lingered long after the plates were cleared. For the wealthy, such festivities were grand, marked by elaborate banquets and glittering balls. For the poor, they were simpler, but no less heartfelt. Perhaps a small tree, a humble pudding, or a gathering of neighbors with shared cheer. Christmas was also a time when acts of charity were expected. Inspired in part by popular writers like Charles Dickens, Victorians emphasized goodwill toward the less fortunate. Wealthier families donated food, clothing, and money to local parishes or charitable societies. Employers sometimes distributed small gifts or coins to workers. Soup kitchens and parish halls served special meals so that even the poorest might taste a bit of holiday cheer. This emphasis on generosity reinforced the idea that Christmas was not only about merriment, but also about compassion. In an age of sharp social divisions, it provided at least a momentary reminder of shared humanity. As Christmas faded, attention turned to the new year. For Victorians, it was a time both of reflection and celebration. Many households marked the occasion with midnight bells, church services, or quiet gatherings around the fire. Others embraced merrier traditions, dancing, feasting, or playing games well into the early hours. In Scotland and northern England, Hogmanay was especially important, with customs of first footing. The first visitor to cross a home's threshold after midnight was believed to set the tone for the year ahead. A tall, dark-haired man bearing gifts of coal, bread, or whiskey was considered especially lucky. Such rituals blended old folklore with the hope of fresh beginnings. Though less prominent today, Twelfth Night was still celebrated in the Victorian era. Marking the end of Christmastide, it often included gatherings with cake, wassailing songs, and playful mischief. In some areas, a king and queen of the feast were chosen by lot, adding a touch of revelry to winter's depths. Candlemas, observed in early February, was quieter but deeply symbolic. Candles were blessed in churches, representing light in darkness. For farming communities, Candlemas also carried weather lore. If Candlemas Day be fair and bright, winter will have another flight. These sayings linked celebration with the practical hope for gentler weather ahead. Beyond formal holidays, winter was a season for community. Villages and towns held fairs, concerts, and social evenings. Music halls offered lively entertainment, while parish halls hosted dances or lectures. Skating on frozen ponds or rivers drew crowds, young and old alike. who glided across the ice or watched from the banks, sipping hot drinks sold by vendors. In wealthier circles, winter balls and assemblies filled the calendar. Gentlemen in black coats and ladies in silks danced by candlelight in glittering rooms, accompanied by orchestras. For others, a simple gathering with neighbors, shared songs, and homemade treats offered warmth of another kind, the warmth of companionship. It is worth noting that celebrations looked very different across social classes. For some, winter meant abundance, tables laden with food, halls decorated with holly and ivy, gifts exchanged beneath twinkling trees. For others, it meant scraping together what little they had, finding joy in a shared orange or a single candle. Yet across these differences, the impulse to celebrate was universal. Whether through lavish feasts or modest gatherings, people sought moments of light, laughter, and renewal in the season's darkest days. Celebrations in Victorian winter were not merely diversions. They were vital expressions of hope and resilience. They reminded people that life, even in hardship, held beauty and meaning. They reinforced bonds of family and community, offering warmth not only of fire, but of spirit. For Victorians, winter celebrations were more than tradition. They were survival of another kind. They carried people through the coldest months, reminding them that joy could be found even amid snow and shadow. And as the candles burned low, songs faded, and families drifted to sleep, there remained a quiet truth that celebration itself was a form of endurance, a way of saying that darkness would not have the final word. Winter in Victorian Britain was long, often stretching from November into March, with only brief moments of respite. The cold months tested not only the body, but also the mind, demanding endurance, patience, and ingenuity. The celebrations of Christmas and New Year brought light and cheer. But once they faded, what remained was the daily challenge of simply holding on until spring returned. By mid-January, the festive season was over. Families packed away their decorations, and the routines of work and survival resumed. Days were short and often bleak. Frost rimed the windows, and streets lay under a dull, heavy sky. For many, this was the hardest part of the season. Without the distraction of holidays, the cold felt sharper, and the darkness seemed to linger endlessly. Victorian diaries often recorded this weariness. Farmers wrote of frozen ground that would not yield to plow or spade. Shopkeepers described dwindling trade as people stayed indoors. Mothers noted children's restlessness, cooped up for weeks without the freedom of fields or gardens. To endure meant finding strength in routine and hope in the knowledge that spring would eventually arrive. Beyond physical hardship, there was the challenge of spirit. Winter was heavy, not only on the body, but also on the mind. The endless nights and dim days weighed on morale, sometimes leading to melancholy. For Victorians, this was often described simply as low spirits. To counter this gloom, people sought small comforts. Families gathered by the fire to tell stories, sing or read aloud. Knitting, sewing, or carving passed long evenings with quiet purpose. Tea, sweetened when possible, offered a moment of warmth. Even the simple act of lighting a candle brought reassurance, pushing back against the surrounding dark. Religious practice also helped sustain many. Sunday services were steady fixtures, bringing communities together and reminding them of faith's promise of renewal. For others, the rhythm of the natural world itself, the knowledge that seasons turned, that spring would follow winter, provided the hope they needed to endure. Though winter felt endless, subtle changes marked the approach of spring. By February, daylight stretched a little longer. Buds began to swell on bare branches, and snowdrops or early crocuses pierced the cold earth. Farmers watched eagerly for signs that fields would soon soften. Children, restless indoors, cheered at the chance of outdoor play when the weather allowed. These small signs were treasured. A patch of green, the call of a returning bird, or the lighter tone of the sky lifted spirits. They reminded Victorians that winter was not permanent, that nature was already preparing for renewal. Ultimately, surviving winter in Victorian times was not about comfort. It was about persistence. Each day brought new tasks: fetching water, stoking fires, stretching food, caring for the sick. These tasks were ordinary, yet they carried extraordinary weight. They kept families alive until the warmth of spring returned. In this way, winter was not only a season to be endured, but also a lesson in resilience. It showed the strength of households, the value of community, and the power of patience. For Victorians, who lived so closely with the cycles of nature, survival through winter was both a necessity and an achievement. As the final snows melted and fields began to stir, families looked back on winter not with fondness, but with relief. They had weathered its trials, held fast through hunger, cold, and weariness. Now, with spring unfolding, they could turn their energies to planting, working, and living anew. Survival, after all, was more than enduring hardship. It was a quiet triumph, a reminder of human adaptability, of the will to persist, and of the unbreakable bond between season and soul. We have traveled together through the long arc of a Victorian winter, from the first frosts that signaled the end of autumn to the rituals of keeping warm, the struggle to secure food, the joy of festive celebrations, and the patient endurance that carried families through the darkest weeks. Each chapter has shown us not just how Victorians lived, but how they endured, with resourcefulness, with community, and with quiet strength. Winter, in those times, was not an inconvenience. It was a force of nature, shaping lives in every detail. It demanded preparation, resilience, and faith in the turning of seasons. For the wealthy, it was a season of fireside gatherings and holiday feasts. For the poor, it was often a time of hardship, where survival meant stretching every crumb and conserving every ember. Yet, across these differences, there was a common thread: the deep awareness that winter could not be avoided, only endured. In reflecting on their lives, we see something timeless. The Victorian winter may belong to another century, but the lessons remain familiar. The value of patience when days feel long, the comfort of small rituals when darkness presses close, the reminder that no matter how heavy a season feels, spring eventually follows. These truths extend beyond history. They belong to us as much as they did to them. Perhaps that is why studying this period feels so calming. It slows us down, reminding us that survival is often not about great victories, but about the simple act of carrying on, one day at a time, one fire tended, one meal shared. There is a quiet dignity in that, and in seeing it, we can feel our own pace and ease. As we close this chapter, imagine once more the Victorian household settling into night. The fire has burned low, the last candle flickers, and the world outside lies still under a blanket of frost. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, its own small triumphs, but for now there is only rest, the long exhale of a winter's evening. And so, as the Victorians once did, we leave the day behind. We allow the weight of the blankets to press gently upon us, the silence to stretch wide and calm, and the steady passage of time to guide us forward. Winter ends, spring comes, the rhythm continues, and you too can let go now, trusting that morning will arrive in its own time. Good night, rest well. May your dreams be gentle and your sleep be deep.